So just to give you a little bit of introduction to me, I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut Medical School in Farmington. Most of my research is in the area of behavioral treatments for addictions. And I'm going to talk today about a specific one called contingency management, which has been probably the majority of my career so far. And I'm, let's see, licensed clinical psychologist. I got into this work because I felt like during that early experience as a clinician, I felt like it was really a revolving door for my patients, and I was looking for the most efficacious treatment out there, and sort of stumbled into contingency management, and that's been the focus of my career since then. As I go, I'm going to share my screen now, but as I go, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me, and especially if you have experience using rewards or contingency management in your clinical work, I would love to hear your experiences. So feel free to speak up. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. And all right, are you seeing the right slideshow view? Heather, can you nod your head? Yes or no? Okay, thank you. You're the only person I can see. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about contingency management. I think of this as sort of like the 101 version, introductory. If you have questions that delve deeper that I'm not touching on, please do speak up and ask them. I'm going to try to touch on the foundations of contingency management, where it came from and how it really got started in the substance use field, some of the early work that established its efficacy, and then more recent work that's been moving toward dissemination and implementation. I'll talk specifically about the national implementation project that we did with the Veterans Administration in their IOP clinics. And then I'll talk a little bit about how CM is used elsewhere outside of the VA. And then if we have time, I'll end with talking about some of the barriers that that clinicians have and organizations have to implementing contingency management sort of in the real world outside of research. So foundations, contingency management has been around for a very long time, probably since the 50s, 60s. It started gaining traction, or what actually started development. It wasn't until the 80s, though, that it gained traction as a treatment that could be applied in clinical settings. And that was because of the cocaine epidemic in the 80s. So clinicians were finding that patients with cocaine use disorders presenting to treatment didn't respond in the same way that their opiate, heroin, or alcohol primary patients did. And so the treatments that were available just weren't working, and they were really searching for something that would work. And so that's how contingency management really kind of started rising in the field as a viable option in the clinical realm. Part of the reason was because there was a big gap in clinical opportunities for those with stimulant use disorders. In the 80s, there were no pharmacotherapy options for cocaine use disorder. That largely remains true today for our stimulant use disorders. And so there's this gap that we hope a strong psychosocial treatment can help fill for those patients with stimulant use disorders, basically providing them an option that fills a gap as they don't have pharmacotherapy options. So at its very basic, what we're doing with contingency management is trying to make abstinence more attractive than continued drug use. So continuing to use drug has some features that attract people and keep them coming and maintain the behavior. So either it's feeling good or relieving withdrawal, or it's social, but there are reasons, positive reasons that people continue using substance. What we want to do is balance that equation by putting some positives on the abstinence side. So let's introduce some positives if you choose to abstain from substance use in the immediate. And the immediate part of it is actually pretty critical. A lot of the gains from recovery are long-term. So it takes many weeks, months, years to really reestablish those family connections, get stable housing, get more stable employment, and so repairs a lot of the damage that's been done over years of substance use. So what can we do in the immediate that makes recovery and abstinence more attractive? So we do that by increasing the positive consequences using monetary incentives and or monetary-based incentives. And all of this work is based on something called reinforcement. So if you remember from your undergrad or subsequent training, you might have touched on operant conditioning and the principles of reinforcement and punishment. Contingency management is really leveraging what we've learned about reinforcement. So just to give you a couple examples of that, these operant conditioning principles of reinforcement and punishment are used in everyday life. They govern a lot of our behavior, whether we're aware of it or not. Some examples on the left of reinforcers in the employment sector. We use them with our children, we use them with our pets. Positive reinforcers, though, at the top there are things that increase the probability of a behavior occurring in the future. So anything that increases the chances of that behavior occurring again is something we would call a positive reinforcer. Of course, reinforcers are pretty highly specific to the individual. So food might be motivating for one person, prizes might be motivating for another, money might be motivating for someone else. So it's whatever increases that person's behavior or chances of doing that behavior in the future. So it's just some examples there. We use these routinely. Think of like a commission salesman. They get a payoff for each sale that they do. So they're highly motivated to do that behavior. With our children, we often use incentives to hopefully shape behavior. Think of the classic, if you're good while we're at the grocery store, we'll get an ice cream cone on the way home. So we're using those rewards to shape the behavior in the immediate, but also hopefully to shape behavior in the long term. Definitely use it in the animal training area. I have 2 pandemic puppies that were adopted since COVID hit, and I'm using treats to help shape their behavior, and that's a really good way to see how the principles of using these reinforcement techniques can really make or break in how you apply them. On the right-hand side, you can see some examples of punishers. Punishers decrease the probability, or they're intended to decrease the probability of a behavior occurring in the future. We use these in the employment sector and with our children, detention and timeout for sure, but I'm just, for the sake of an example, going to talk about the fines. I'll come back to that in a few minutes, but we definitely use them in the legal system. Fines, tickets, jail, all meant to decrease the probability of someone doing that behavior again in the future. Putting this together, what we have is a behavior that should be followed by a consequence. And if that consequence is a reinforcer, then it's going to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. If it's a punisher, it would decrease the probability of that behavior. So what we're looking at usually is trying to increase abstinence. So our behavior would be submitting a negative sample. The consequence would be giving a reward of some sort of reinforcer. And hopefully that would increase the chance that they submit negative samples in the future. Now, the critical ingredients to contingency management are in the drop-down box. So contingency management, for it to be effective, has to be crystal clear. So the clinician has to understand everything and the rules and how to apply the program. And the client has to understand exactly what's expected of them and the consequences of those behaviors. Contingency management also has to be consistent. If we are somewhat willy-nilly in how we apply these incentives, then the entire structure of contingency management breaks down, and then you're not going to see the level of efficacy on patient change in patient outcomes that we would have expected to see based on the research literature. So consistency is very important. What that would mean in the context of reinforcing negative urines means testing urines frequently, regularly, and reinforcing it immediately. That immediately concept is the last ingredient there. So timely reinforcement of behaviors is also a critical ingredient. So the classic issue that comes up with this in contingency management is people are starting to think about using contingency management, but they want to send their urines out to labs. Labs introduce delays, so it's a day or two later when they get the results back, and then they're reinforcing in a much distant manner from the actual behavior. So to get around that, to avoid that, what we would do is use rapid screen tests. So we collect the urine, read the results immediately, and deliver the reinforcement immediately. So clear, consistent, and timely are you can think of them as active ingredients of contingency management, and without those active ingredients, you will not achieve the benefit in patient outcome that you're looking for. Now, reinforcers and punishers are already used in substance use treatment. And in fact, I like to highlight the AA-NA group, because a lot of clinicians think that contingency management would not be compatible with that particular philosophy. But in fact, AA were early adopters of these reinforcement principles. They were very aware that coffee and food get people in the door. Group recognition and approval is used frequently, and status recognitions like 30-day pins and certificates and acting as sponsor. The AA model has already really grasped onto the idea of reinforcement and is using it regularly and in many different ways. We also do this in outpatient treatment with certificates of completion. I see those quite often and certainly praise. And then, of course, in the methadone setting, the methadone clinics were early, early adopters of reinforcement ideas. So having people work for things like take-home doses, patients will work for that. It's a reinforcer. So setting sort of bars, like if you meet this goal, then you can have access to this reinforcer, like a take-home dose or priority dosing windows, things like that. Punishers are also used in the clinical realm. So I think we're moving away from this, but even 5 years ago, it was pretty common that patients would be dismissed or discontinued from treatment. Or something that does still happen today is that when someone is not doing so well, maybe they have continued positive UAs, then they sort of step up a level of care, or they have increased monitoring consequences. We think of that as clinically needed and a benefit to the patient, but of course the patients experience it as punitive. They don't like the idea of increased monitoring or increased visits and things like that. So from the patient experience, they experience it as a punisher. So if these reinforcers and punishers are being used in clinical services already, why are they often ineffective? Here's just a couple of the reasons that I run into fairly frequently. One is that the behavior that they're focusing on, the target behavior, is the language that we would use. That target behavior is not specific enough. So it's not objective, it's not defined, and sometimes it's not verifiable. So what you want to look for is something that is objectively verifiable and something that you can monitor frequently. An example of well, let me start with a good example. A good example would be a UA. It's either positive or negative, right? So that's objective, it's verifiable, it's very clear, there's no ambiguity. So that would be a good target behavior. Same thing with attendance. The person is either there or not there. That's pretty objective, or with some rules can be very objective and verifiable. Now, a bad example of this principle would be something like good participation. So I hear that a lot. We want patients to participate during group, and it has to be at a good level. Well, here's a problem, because now we're in more of a subjective realm, right? So one clinician might say, oh, that was good participation, and another clinician would say no. Then that means that it is not objective. If it's not objective and it's not verifiable, then it's not a good target for contingency management. So you would just cross that off the list and look for another behavior that you can objectively verify. Another problem that I run into is that clinics that are considering using contingency management want to set the bar way too high for the patient. With contingency management, the treatment is access to the reinforcers. So we need to make a goal that is accessible, attainable. So that means setting a goal that patients are actually going to be able to hit. So the classic example for me when I'm doing consulting with clinics that are interested in contingency management is that they want to require abstinence from all substances in order to access the reinforcer. So why would that not be such a great idea? Well, let's say you have a polysubstance user. What are the chances that, or let's take your whole clinic-wide sample of polysubstance users. How many of them are actually going to be able to be negative from all substances that they're currently using? If you want to actually have them access the reinforcer, access the treatment, then you would set something much more achievable for them. So for example, what we would do is steer you to target stimulant negative urines or even cocaine negative urine. So either a single drug or a single drug class. That is something that is probably more achievable for your polysubstance users. So they may not be ready or willing to give up marijuana quite yet, but we can maybe get them moving along and making change in their stimulant use. Consequences are not consistent would be the next one. So this is what, again, what makes or breaks contingency management is how it's delivered. It needs to be consistent, predictable. Everybody has to understand the rules. And there has to be follow through. So if the UA is positive, there's no incentives delivered, no reinforcers delivered. And if the sample is negative, then the person does earn incentives. The last issue that I run into frequently is that clinics really want to do CM, but they just don't have the finances to provide tangible rewards for patients. So tangible, gift cards or prizes, things along those lines. I'll show you some examples. And while there is a lot to say for using praise and certificates and non-monetary rewards, it is not the same thing as contingency management. And the monetary amount that you're offering in CM is sort of like the dose. So we would never offer an ineffective dose of medication to our patient. And in the same way, we want to offer an effective magnitude of contingency management in order to see the outcomes we're looking for. So here are the three basic principles of contingency management. So first, you're monitoring a specific objective verifiable target behavior. Usually for UAs, that means twice weekly. You can do 2 to 3 times a weekly, but I do usually twice a weekly. The second step is providing that tangible positive reinforcement each time the target behavior occurs. So twice weekly UAs, each time they're negative, the patient earns a reward. And then the last step is if the target behavior is not met, then you withhold reinforcement. So if the UA today is positive for stimulants, then the patient earns no incentives that day. And then sometimes what we'll do is something called a reset. So they sort of have to start at the bottom of the ladder and work their way up for their next UA. I'll show you examples of what that means in a second. Okay, so there are 2 major types of contingency management. One is called voucher contingency management. The other is prize-based CM, or also called fishbowl. I'll show you an example of both. Here is the original voucher study that was done in the late 1980s and published in the early 90s. This is the Steve Higgins group in Vermont. They are still the leaders of this particular type of contingency management. They set up a system that was 12 weeks long. Patients came in 3 times a week for those 12 weeks. Contingency management was being combined here with community reinforcement approach, which is already a fairly robust platform therapy. And again, this was done because they were seeing that patients with cocaine use disorders were not responding to what we have like standard available treatments. So they picked the most robust platform therapy out there in community reinforcement approach, and then they're layering contingency management on top of that to see if they can boost the outcomes for patients. So how this works is the patient would submit UAs 3 times a week. The first one, if it was negative, they could earn $2.50 in vouchers. And that increases sequentially for each consecutive time the patient meets the behavior. So as long as they stay negative, the value of the voucher increases that they earn that day. So from $2.50 to $3.75 to $5 to $6.25 to $7.50 and so on. In this particular protocol, they also earned a $10 bonus if all 3 samples in a given week were negative. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the total. If you add up all of those voucher amounts that a patient could earn on a daily basis or on each visit, it adds up to just under $1,000 for a single patient for a 12-week treatment episode. So that's where we're starting. These are the outcomes from that first trial. You see retention on the left and abstinence outcomes on the right. Again, they're comparing contingency management with community reinforcement approach to community reinforcement approach only. So that's the yellow. And then the CM combined with CRA is the pink. Looking at retention on the left first, you can see that contingency management retains people, this was 12 weeks, retains people at a much higher rate than the community reinforcement approach alone.
Hello?
Hi, can you mute yourself? Okay. anyone has the ability to mute other people, that would be really helpful. Okay, on the right-hand side, you can see the abstinence. This was the percentage of patients that achieved 8 weeks or more of continuous abstinence. So abstinence with no breaks in between, so consecutive continuous abstinence. And that's actually a fairly high outcome to achieve. 2 months of solid abstinence is what they were looking at. And you can see that the contingency management group more than doubled the percentage of patients that were able to meet that outcome of 2 months of abstinence compared to just CRA alone. So these were very promising initial outcomes from that study. That particular study followed patients a year later. So remember, the contingency management incentives were only in place for 12 weeks. Patients had 12 weeks of reward access, then it was removed. And what they did is followed patients a year later to see how they were doing. And these are the outcomes you're seeing on this slide. This is the percentage of patients that were cocaine abstinent at follow-up a year later. 60% were cocaine abstinent in the contingency management group compared to 45% in the community reinforcement approach group. Remember, again, this is almost a year after the contingencies ended. So this is looking at long-term outcomes after receiving contingency management versus another platform therapy. And one of the things that we've learned is that the longest duration patients can achieve during treatment is highly predictive of long-term abstinence. That's very true for contingency management. It's also true for most other treatments as well. So it's not about patients being able to sort of have spotty abstinence, like a pattern where they are maybe negative during the week, but then they use on the weekend. So Monday comes around and they're testing positive. That would be sort of an intermittent schedule. They're not using sometimes, and then they have breaks here and there. What we really want to promote, and what contingency management is very successful at, is promoting durations, consecutive durations of abstinence. So that would be 2 consecutive months with no breaks of abstinence there. And that is highly predictive of how people do later. I also just want to throw this in. This is a very recent publication that just came out this year from my group. And we looked at, there's a longstanding criticism of contingency. Once you take away the incentives, people go straight back to their old behaviors, and the abstinence doesn't persist. Well, I showed you the Higgins study. That's one example. We also looked at a meta-analysis, which means we looked at all the studies out there published and kind of combined them to get an estimate across multiple studies. What does this picture look like in terms of long-term outcomes for CM? Now, the really important part of this paper is that we sort of held all studies to the same criteria of having objectively measured their abstinence outcome. What we found when we started looking is that a lot of what we know about CBT and motivational interviewing and these other treatments that we think of as the gold standard, many of them are published using not objectively verified long-term outcomes. So self-report, they're relying on self-report. And in that sense, contingency management being compared to self-report outcomes sort of came out on the losing side. When you hold people to the same standard that you must use objective outcomes, it turns out that contingency management does better than these other what we would call gold standard treatments like CBT, relapse prevention, motivational interviewing, and so on. So in the long run, in the short term, contingency management is definitely beating these other treatments in terms of generating larger treatment effect sizes on better patient outcomes. And in the long run, so months, years after the contingencies are removed, our CM patients are still doing better. So contingency management works. Those early studies showed that, but the next question was, can we make it more affordable, right? $1,000 per patient is a really high sticker price. So what can we do to lower that? And that is where Nancy Petri came into the field. That is her in the picture there. She sadly passed away a few years ago, but she was a really dominant figure in contingency management as well as substance use research more broadly. She developed the fishbowl or prize-based contingency management. We call it fishbowl CM because we use a literal fishbowl like you see in the picture. That's actually one of our clinic fishbowls. And what it has is about 500 slips of paper in there. Half of them are winning, half are non-winning. So we're introducing probability in earning. So sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. We're also introducing variability in prize magnitude. So sometimes when you win a prize, it's a small prize. Sometimes when you win a prize, it's a big prize. Here's what that looks like. So in our 500 slip bowl, half of them are non-winning, good jobs, or any kind of positive affirmation. Large amount are small prizes worth about $1. A smaller amount are larges worth about $20. And one slip in the bowl is a jumbo prize worth $100. This is what the schedule would look like for a 12-week treatment. In this one, we're using twice weekly visits. So something like a Monday, Thursday schedule. And you can see that now instead of monetary voucher amounts that increase over time, what we're increasing, the escalation component, is the number of draws, the number of picks out of the fishbowl. So what that would look like is the first time they come in and submit a cocaine negative sample, they would earn 1 draw. If they're still negative on Thursday when I see them, they would earn 2 draws. If they're again negative next week when I see them, they'd go up to 3 draws, and then 4 draws and 5 draws and so on. So that escalation feature gives them more and more opportunities as long as they're demonstrating consecutive abstinence. Now you'll see in this particular example, we cap the draws at 8. So once someone reaches 8 draws per visit for a negative UA, they would stay at 8 for the rest of the 12 weeks. And that's a cost saving measure as well as a time saving measure. So I did one protocol where I had unlimited, no cap. So by week 10, 11, 12, they were earning 40 something draws, and it takes a long time to draw 40 slips and open them up and whatnot. So the cap is introduced to control costs and time impact. On the left, you can see a picture of one of our prize cabinets. So remember, timely reinforcement is really critical to CM. So by timely, we're not only measuring the UA and delivering the reinforcement immediately, but they get their prize and walk out the door with it the same day. So for example, let's say they had 2 draws today, one of them was a large and the other was a good job. They would take that large slip and trade it for a large prize out of our cabinet that's worth about $20. That might be something like a $20 gift card, or depending on your population, if they're establishing new housing, for example, kitchen appliances are really popular, pan sets. At our homeless shelter, things like sleeping bags or winter clothing items were really popular, things along that line. All right. So here are the results of that first prize-based contingency management study. Oh, I should say this particular protocol, well, I'll show you on the next slide. Let me just keep going. So these are the outcomes for that first prize-based contingency management. This was done in a VA IOP clinic, and they were targeting patients with alcohol use disorder. You can see the retention graph on the left and then the drinking outcomes on the right. Starting with retention on the left, the pink is the contingency management again. That was combined with IOP versus IOP alone is the yellow. All right, so what you can see is probably a picture that you're familiar with. People start on IOP, and then after about 2 weeks, you're starting to see some substantial dropout. That's the yellow line. You can see that over time, more and more people are dropping out until by week 8, you have about 20% of the original group retained in IOP services. In contrast, the pink retains people quite well. So that's one of the sort of, I think, special ingredients of CM is that it keeps people engaged in treatment. So by the end of the 8 weeks, we're looking at something like 85% of the CM group is still retained in IOP services versus something like 25 in the standard care group. On the right-hand side, you're looking at the time until their first heavy drinking episode. So you can think of the first slip or first relapse. Looking at the yellow line first, you can see a steeper decrease. So we're losing more and more people to that first relapse. The pink, on the other hand, we're retaining more people, meaning fewer people are having those relapses or slips. So so contingency management, prize-based contingency management is effective. That first study showed. The next question was naturally, how do these two systems compare? And so there's been a handful of studies that have compared contingency management using the vouchers versus the prizes head to head. So this is just one example of those studies. This was done in a methadone clinic. So standard methadone clinic services are the yellow, the first bar. The light pink is the voucher program, so escalating voucher amounts over time. And then the darker pink is the prize-based contingency management system. For this particular study, the vouchers were arranged to be just about $600 per patient for the 12-week treatment episode, and the prize base was about half that at $300. Control everything else held constant, so same duration, same frequency of meeting with the patient, and so on. And you can see that the two pink bars are essentially equivalent. So voucher and prize-based contingency management generate very similar outcomes, but at different price points. So they're both effective, and often people will pick or choose the one that works for them. For many clinics interested in CM, they want to go with the cheaper option, which is understandable. Now, I mentioned that the magnitude of CM is sort of like the dose. So we don't prescribe ineffective doses of medication. Similarly, if you're going to do CM, you want an effective magnitude or an effective dose. This particular study looked at that question. How much could we decrease the amount of incentives that we're giving before it becomes ineffective? Again, really trying to get at how cheap can we make this and still see benefits to our patients. So this study was all of the conditions, all of the CM conditions were prize-based. We were comparing standard IOP, that's the yellow bar, a low-cost prize-based CM, that's the light pink, and it was arranged to be about $80 for 12 weeks of treatment. And then our sort of standard contingency management, which was about $240 in cost for 12 weeks. So the outcomes of this were that the dark pink, the $240 condition, showed a significant improvement over the standard care services. So with contingency management at the $240 range, you see a benefit compared to standard IOP. However, the light pink condition, the one in the middle, that was about $80 on average, was slightly numerically higher than standard care, but not statistically. So what that means is that people are spending money for that $80 condition, but not really seeing impact on patient outcomes. So this told us that the $80 condition is too low. It's too low of a dose to be effective, and that we really need to stick with the, I would say nowadays where our price tag for an effective contingency management is somewhere in the $300 to $350 range for a 12-week treatment episode of price-based contingency management. That same effective range for voucher, I would say, is somewhere in the like $750 to $1,000 per patient for a 12-week treatment episode. So the original studies were done quite heavily concentrated in the cocaine and opioid use disorder area, mainly because the UA technology fits really well. So we can usually get by with 3 times a week or twice weekly sampling, and that's very ideal. But we've certainly looked at extending contingency management out to other substances, such as benzodiazepines, marijuana, nicotine, and alcohol. Now, I've put asterisks by the bottom 3 there because while contingency management is effective for all of these substance use disorders, it is much harder to implement for marijuana, nicotine, and alcohol. So let me start with alcohol. We're starting to see progress in our technology for monitoring alcohol, but we're not quite where we need to be. But let's just say we are stuck with breathalyzers. Well, breathalyzers don't test back very far. So it's something like 6 to 8 hours. We're getting a snapshot of use in the last 6 to 8 hours. If we really want to have good measurement and good monitoring of alcohol use, we would have to have somebody come in 2 to 3 times a day to give us breathalyzers in order to feel like we're really capturing the full picture of alcohol use, which is a pretty burdensome thing to ask a patient to do. So you can focus on alcohol, it's just a little bit harder. Nicotine, similar problem. So we can test for, you can use a breathalyzer to test for nicotine exposure. It's actually carbon monoxide exposure, but it only tests like something like the last 4 to 6 hours. So I have done smoking cessation with contingency management. And I had my patients come in twice a day to give me samples. Because I wanted to at least approach the idea that I was getting full coverage and not letting too much smoking behavior slip in there unmonitored. Even twice a day is a little bit on the skimpy side, but we did that in a homeless shelter. So patients were around, and it wasn't too burdensome to have them come in. I've also seen that done in residential settings, so they're there. It's not that burdensome to come run by and do a breathalyzer. It only takes a minute, so you can do that more feasibly. In an outpatient setting, that just probably wouldn't work to have patients coming in, twice or 3 times a day. Marijuana, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. So marijuana stays in your system for so long that we really can't reinforce proximal behavior, right? So it takes them, maybe a chronic user, a couple weeks to test negative for marijuana. And so because they're not testing negative in that 2-week period, we're unable to reinforce the behavior that's actually happening. So that's a problem because we want proximal reinforcement. So as they're making the behavior as close in time to that behavior change, we want to be reinforcing it. So often what we will do in marijuana protocols is reinforce attendance for the first, say, 2 weeks. And then the patient switches into negative UAs for marijuana. All right, so contingency management, that was sort of like the background of establishing contingency management's efficacy from the research standpoint. The next really step is to demonstrate that outside of the hands of the researchers, that contingency management remains effective. So the National Drug Abuse Clinical Trials Network adopted prize-based contingency management as something that they wanted to test at the national level. You can see the citations there at the bottom. One of the citations, the 2005 paper focused on implementing price-based CM in IOP settings. And then the 2006 paper implemented contingency management in methadone settings. All of these clinics were focusing on stimulant abstinence and used a 12-week twice-weekly protocol of price-based CM. For both studies, the IOP and the methadone, contingency management outperformed their standard clinic services. So patients did better with CM compared to what they could normally access in standard services. So CM works. Something that people often don't realize is that CM does work better than things like CBT and relapse prevention. This is just one example from a meta-analysis. The greenish color is contingency management average effect size across studies. The yellow and red are CBT and relapse prevention. So you can see that the green bar is bigger, so bigger average patient outcome. The purple is, I think, sort of where the magic happens with CM is when you layer CM with something else that's effective. So CBT being the primary one. When you layer CM with something that's already very effective, like CBT, you get an even bigger boost on your outcome. So that would be kind of where we want to steer, is combining CM with other effective platform therapies. Now, a lot of my work has been establishing who contingency management works for. So which patients benefit most from contingency management, which patients don't benefit from CM, so that we can start steering our limited resources to the patients who will most benefit. So we've looked at a lot of things in the demographic characteristics area, gender, race, income, housing, also clinical characteristics, much of which focus on severity. So do they have co-occurring use, co-occurring disorders, psychiatric severity, medical, so on and so forth. I'm just going to focus on one of the demographics. So I've looked at a couple studies looking at whether the patient's income affects whether they respond to contingency management or not. So this came directly out of comments and questions that I would get from clinicians. They would say, oh, well, our clinic base is a little bit more well off. We're not sure that they're going to respond to these dollar prizes. And so I was able to look at that question in data. So I did it twice. I first looked at whether a patient's past year income had anything to do with how they responded to contingency management, and it didn't. All patients, generally there was no effective income, so patients respond regardless. And then someone gave me the feedback that, well, maybe the past year income isn't so important. Maybe it's the income they're receiving while they're in IOP. Maybe that's what's going to determine whether those dollar prizes are motivating or not. So I looked at the question again. Does income that you receive during treatment, during IOP, does that have anything to do with how you respond to contingency management? And again, the answer was no. So These monetary incentives, although they sound small, $1 here, $1 there, $20 prize here and there, and so on, they do actually impact behavior even for our more well-off substance using clients. I'll show you one more example from the psychiatric area. So this was, we took a large sample of patients who had been exposed to contingency management, and we categorized them according to whether they were low psychiatric severity, moderate, or high psychiatric severity. What you're seeing now is the IOP patients. So they only received IOP, and you can see that those in the low psychiatric condition did a little bit better, and then it's like a step down. Moderate did slightly less well at retaining, and then high psychiatric severity had the least or the lowest numbers for retention. Now, that's probably consistent with your clinical experience that the patients who sort of slip through the cracks and slip out of treatment are those that have more issues going on, higher psychiatric severity. Now, that is the same graph. So the yellow is the exact same as the last slide, but now I've layered the contingency management group beside it. And you can see that it has sort of the opposite. Notice that the yellow is sort of trending down as psychiatric severity gets worse, retention gets worse. In contrast, the contingency management group, as psychiatric severity gets worse, we're actually retaining them better. And so again, I feel like one of the magical ingredients of contingency management is that we retain people in treatment long enough that they can be exposed to your clinical skills that you're teaching them, coping skills, relapse prevention, all of those things. So this is just one example, but I do think contingency management really is maximizing our ability to serve sort of our harder to treat patients, the ones that tend to drop out of treatment early. I've mentioned IOP and methadone clinic services and community reinforcement approach, but contingency management can also be combined with just about any other platform therapy out there. CBT and MI are common. Some have looked at using it with computerized therapies, and which may actually increase now that we have COVID going on. And then of course, it can be combined with pharmacotherapies as well. It also works for a lot of different behaviors. Most of what I've talked about today has been abstinence-focused CM, but we have looked at attendance, reinforcing medication adherence, even reinforcing exercise. And then of course, there's also, we can reinforce engagement in therapeutic activities. So what we do, you probably do this as part of standard clinical practice. You sort of establish treatment-related goals for each patient, highly individualized and specific to that person. Well, what we can do is pick activities related to those treatment goals and reinforce progress week after week on those activities. So, for example, someone with medical issues might be establishing care, getting a primary care provider, attending appointments, and getting medication, and so on. Someone who has employment as a treatment goal might be working on resumes and interviewing and things along those lines. So CM is efficacious. It generalizes to most of our patients, but is it actually being used clinically? And the answer is no. It is the least likely evidence-based treatment to be used in the clinical realm. That has been so for a very long time, remains so today, unfortunately. But I do want to talk about one success story. So this was the VA implementation. They implemented CM nationally in their IOP clinics. And how this came about was that in 2008, the VA recognized contingency management as an evidence-based treatment. Then in 2011, they did a look back. So they looked at the prior year, 2010, and said, how many of our veterans got access to this evidence-based treatment? It was 1%. 1% of veterans had access to something that the VA had already called evidence-based. And as you can imagine, for the VA, that's an issue. They're saying something is really effective, and then none of their veterans are getting access to it. So they tried to solve that problem. In 2011, we set off on doing regional trainings for the VA providers. We did a sort of a train the trainer model. So clinicians, clinic leaders, usually supervisors, would come to our training. We would train them. It was about a day and a half of training. they would go back to their home clinic and then train the frontline clinical staff to implement contingency management with their patients. We trained them how to do voucher and price-based CM, taught them how to do it effectively and how to keep all of those parameters like timeliness and consistency and so on, so that it would be effective in changing patient outcomes. But we also let them sort of take it home and adapt it to what made sense for them at their home clinic. We trained, I think, 187 providers total that first year, which represented 113 different programs. And I should say that the VA really, really committed to this. So not only did they say they wanted this to happen, they wanted their veterans to have access to CM, but they put money behind it. They provided these trainings, they provided startup funds to like seed money to start the prize cabinets and so on. By summer of 2012, the VA committed more dollars to it. And by late 2012, we were seeing about 69% of those originally trained programs had implemented CM. If you know anything about the implementation literature, you know that that's a hugely successful implementation outcome. And so we were very pleased to see that. Subsequently, the VA ran into a little bit of financial concern about how they would support the continuation of the CM program. And that is where the canteen system stepped in. So it's a nonprofit. If they use their leftover funds at the end of the year to fund veteran-related initiatives, and they decided that they were going to focus those monies toward continuation of the CM program. So programs could apply for sort of like canteen scholarships to continue their CM program. And that, I believe, is continued, certainly continued through 2018, but I think it's still true for even today. By 2015, we had looked at, we had trained some more programs, more clinicians, and we had about 90% implementation, which was amazing. And then by late 2018, we had 95% of people who had been trained, clinics that were trained implementing. Huge success story. In terms of like actually getting from the training stage to actually implementing and making this accessible to patients. If you have any interest in implementing CM or reading more about it, I would point you toward these particular publications. You can read about how the VA came around with the idea of CM and sort of the steps that were involved in implementing it. It also provides a really good model. We gave them sort of a sample model to start with, 12 weeks, twice weekly, prize-based contingency management. We gave them a model schedule like the one I showed you earlier, start at 1 draw, escalate by 1, cap at 8. And most programs use that, not all, but most. Most programs also focused on abstinence, a few focused on attendance. Here are some of the data that we had as of late 2018. So we had 123 sites operational. They had served just under 4,000 veterans with contingency management, collected over 50,000 urine samples, of which the vast majority were negative. But the bottom is what I want to draw your attention to. 75% of these clinics were regularly participating in coaching calls. So we provided not only that initial training at the beginning, the regional trainings, but then offered pre-implementation coaching and post-implementation coaching calls, where if a clinic was struggling with how to modify something or came up against a problem that they needed some expert input on, they had the ability to jump on these coaching calls and ask questions. It also turned out to be really useful for onboarding new people, so they could hear from clinics that had been doing this a while what worked and what didn't work. So that was the VA experience, where a lot of highly intensive, high quality training was provided and money was provided for startup funds. But my question has often been focused on what happens outside of that. So when patients or when clinics don't have the ability to sit down for an hour or a day and a half of training, and they don't have startup funds to support the program, what actually happens? So I've looked at that a couple times. This particular study was, I think, over 600 clinicians in the substance use field, and I was asking them if they use incentives with their patients, and if so, how much? What was the magnitude per client? And so you can see that the big slice of the pie here are people, the blue, who don't use any monetary incentives with their patients. So $0. And the next biggest slice of the pie is about $25 or less. So something like a pizza party or an outing or things like that, often at the end of treatment. So again, getting back to the principles of CM, where you want timely reinforcement as the behavior is occurring. It's great to do a pizza party or a celebration of completion at the end of hitting a milestone or things like that. But that is quite different than what CM does. CM is reinforcing, developing ongoing progress, not a goal that's completed at the end. And you can see that the smaller slices of pie, the orangey color, those are really the more effective range of doses of contingency management, and they're the least likely to be used. So the takeaway from that is really when rewards are used in clinical services, it's very rarely done so at a magnitude that we would consider that effective for contingency management. This was another study. I was looking at people who said that they were doing reward systems with patients, contingency management with patients. So I asked what structure they're using. Prize-based contingency management was the most common of the evidence-based structures for CM. Of course, the biggest category is the other, which meant that I didn't recognize it as an evidence-based structure for delivering incentives. So it wasn't prize, it wasn't voucher. Didn't meet any of those criteria. So often what that meant was it was kind of unstructured, unpredictable, or maybe it was a reward that was offered at the, when someone had done 8 weeks of treatment, then they got a big reward or something like that. So not something that I would consider contingency management. On the right-hand side, you can see the behaviors that the clinicians were most often targeting. Attendance far and away is the most common behavior. Clinics veer toward attendance reinforcement, I think, because it doesn't involve having to get the urines and definitely you don't have to deal with the hurdle of having rapid screens instead of sending them out for labs. However, I will I will caution you that although attendance-based contingency management is effective, your biggest bang for your buck is an abstinence-based CM. You will see the biggest impact on patient outcomes with abstinence-based CM protocols. I also looked at how well clinicians were adhering to some of the parameters that we associate with CM's efficacy. So I looked at magnitude, which we've discussed already. That's sort of like the dose of CM. I also looked at the immediacy question. We've touched on that immediate reinforcement same day is important, not delaying it. And then I also looked at frequency. We generally want to see for an abstinence-based protocol twice weekly. Sometimes attendance will go down to weekly, but you don't want to go less than weekly. So I looked at frequency, and then of course escalation, which we've already talked about. So does the voucher amount or the number of draws increase sequentially for consecutive behavior? So what I was really looking at here is whether clinicians who had extensive training in CM, did they do better at adhering with these principles, these parameters of effectiveness than clinicians who had not had extensive training in contingency management. It turns out that the top two, magnitude and immediacy, are associated with more extensive training in reward delivery. So the people who had more extensive training were more likely to use higher magnitudes of rewards and much more likely to do immediate reinforcement, same day reinforcement. However, training didn't seem to impact frequency or use of escalation. But by and far, my takeaway from this is not necessarily the training part of it. It's the fact that nearly 50% of these protocols didn't use escalation. That's the bottom right-hand corner. That's concerning because nearly every research-based CM protocol uses escalation. So already we're seeing a very big step away from what we would consider evidence-based parameters of CM when we transition from the research world to the clinical realm. Same thing with frequency. The percentage of people that were doing rewards less than weekly is quite concerning because that's just not consistent with CM. So what are the barriers to implementing widely and with fidelity? many of them are attitudes and perspectives towards there are positives. So let me start on the positive picture. And I'll say that the top one up there is probably the most effective strategy that we had with the VA experience. There are people, it was more so, 10 years back than nowadays, but I still encounter it sometimes where clinicians just have a philosophical difference with the idea of rewarding patients. But in the VA, the most effective thing we could do to counteract that is to ask, what right do we have to deny access to an evidence-based treatment to these patients? And especially in the context of veterans, that was very effective at convincing clinicians to sort of get past their personal thoughts about CM. Another one I get is that something like patients should be motivated on their own, not by rewards. And essentially how I think of that is like, I wish my clients came through the door fully motivated for recovery and were, excited and 100% committed, but that is just not our reality. Our reality is that patients' motivation for change fluctuates almost daily, maybe even throughout the course of the days. We might get them at a point where they are motivated, and then the next day, maybe not so, and then they maybe come back and cycle through. Contingency management can break through that. So where someone's motivation for change is waning, contingency management might keep that person retained in treatment where otherwise they might not, and where they, where they would have dropped out. I'm going to skip the rest there for time. The negative sides, a lot of concerns about cost, which I feel like are very fair criticisms. Should want to change on their own. I mentioned won't last. The effects won't last after the rewards are removed. We touched on that already. Another one that I would occasionally get is that they liken contingency management to bribery. So bribing patients to be sober or for negative UAs. Just keep in mind, bribery is usually getting someone to do something against their best interest. So you look the other way, take this bribe and look the other way while I do something illegal is a bribe. In contingency management, we're rewarding patients' efforts. They're doing something in their benefit, and we're rewarding that effort in progress. So I don't think of it as the same as a bribe. I have done a little bit of assessment of what clinicians see as the top barriers for contingency management. These are the top 5 from a study that I did, almost 10 years ago now. Many people are worried about what happens after the contingencies are withdrawn. We've touched on that. Some are concerned about research evidence. Another one is that a more practical concern that patients would sell or trade these gifts for drugs. Another one is that it might undermine their internal motivation. So having access to these rewards might undermine their internal motivation for recovery. And then of course the expense. I've already touched on the contingency piece of it, just to expand a little bit more on that. This is that original Higgins study that I showed you, the very first one. The neat thing about this study was this particular graphic. So contingency management was only offered for 12 weeks. But the CRA persisted for 6 months, so up to week 24. So what you're looking at here is the 2 groups. The pink is the CM that was layered on top of the CRA, community reinforcement approach. And then the yellow is just the CRA, community reinforcement approach. So let's first look at the 2 bars on the left, weeks 1 through 12. This is when the contingencies were in place, the rewards were in place. And you can see, consistent with what we looked at before, that contingency management outperforms the CRA alone. But here's where I want you to focus now. Let's look at the next set of 12 weeks. Now we've taken out the rewards, no more vouchers, those ended. And now they're just getting CRA. And let's look at the outcomes there. And you can see a persistence of both groups actually do a little worse, which is normal. And when you look at treatment outcomes, they tend to get worse over time the further away from admission. So both groups decrease a little bit, but you can see the contingency management group is still way outperforming the CRA alone group, even though the contingencies have already ended. So I feel like the criticisms about, what happens when the contingencies end are often a more overblown than the reality of what happens. The next two concerns, the research evidence doesn't apply. I feel like this comes from the pharmaceutical realm, where pharmaceutical trials pick very, ideal or sort of clean patient basis to test their new pharmacy, their new medication on. Somebody who's got no complications, moderate severity, no other issues going on. And we know that that's just not our reality for most of our patients. Most of our patients have comorbidities, have variable severities, and so on. So I don't think, while I feel like the research evidence criticism is very applicable to the pharmacotherapy studies that are often published, I don't think that same criticism carries over to the contingency management research. All of our research in the price-based contingency management world has been done in community clinics, so IOPs and methadone centers throughout New England. Most of our research has been done at clinics you're probably familiar with in Connecticut. We are accessing the same patient base that you serve every day. So I feel like our research on price-based contingency management and the same for the voucher-based contingency management as well has been the very patients you serve. So I feel like I think we've addressed that. The concern about selling or trading drugs, selling the items for drugs, is a valid concern. The neat thing about contingency management, though, is that if it's well designed, carefully designed, then it's self-correcting. So let's say somebody comes in Thursday, has a negative UA, and they earn a $20 gift card, and they take that gift card home with them. Let's say they trade it for drugs. If you've set up your contingency management program, we should see that positive sample the next time that they come in. Now, where you can go wrong is that you don't set up your monitoring schedule effectively. So let's say you only do UAs once a week, probably not going to catch that, or your odds of catching that are lower. And so the frequency of monitoring is really critical here in contingency management, because if someone did sell or trade that item, it would catch it the next time you have a scheduled UA. The next concern is about the internal motivation. So what I also find from a clinical perspective is that patients are very motivated by the prizes in the beginning, sort of that's why they're there. But you tend to see a change. So as someone is progressing, as they're consistently negative, UAs are being submitted, as they're getting some recovery time under them, they start focusing much more on the fact that they're getting all of these benefits from their sobriety or recovery. So they're seeing, more stability in the relationships, or they were invited to a family function that hasn't happened in a long time. They're starting to see the natural aspects, the naturally reinforcing aspects of sobriety happen. And then there's this shift. So the incentives get them in the beginning, get them in the door, and motivate them to stick with treatment. And then you start to see a shift where those are far less salient over time, and the natural reinforcing aspects of recovery take over. And then, of course, we've looked at it scientifically, and we found that CM doesn't actually adversely impact motivation to change. But I feel like seeing it clinically, seeing that someone's motivated for the prizes in the beginning, and then seeing that shift where they're talking more and more about the benefits that they're seeing in their life is very powerful. Another concern that's often raised is not liking the idea of giving a reward for one behavior when the other is not met. So the classic example of that would be reinforcing a single drug or single drug class. And then let's say they turn up marijuana positive. So you would still reinforce the stimulant negative sample, even if they're testing positive for marijuana. And some clinicians have trouble with that concept. Again, that they want that bar to be perfection. So you have to be negative for everything in order to access the incentives. But we find that we don't actually have to do that. Setting the bar low makes the treatment accessible to patients and achievable, which is what we want. And I'm going to steer your attention first to the middle graph here. This was the alcohol study, the price-based contingency management that I showed you earlier. Remember that they were focusing on alcohol abstinence, but they measured illicit substance use as well. So what you can see is the first set of graphs there, yellow, just as a reminder, yellow is standard IOP services. The pink is CM added on top of the standard services. So at intake, they're fairly similar, the two groups, the CM and the standard care, in terms of percent positives for illicit substances, fairly similar. Maybe contingency management even had a few more people who were positive for illicit substances at intake. And then you can see the 4-week point is halfway through treatment. What we're seeing is that the standard care group had a fairly sizable proportion of patients testing positive for illicit substances, about 35%, versus a suppression in illicit substance use among our CM patients. And then you see that replicated again at week 8, a suppression among our CM patients of the illicit substances. Keep in mind that we weren't reinforcing illicit substance abstinence, so they could still earn incentives for the alcohol negative breathalyzers, even if they were testing positive for something else. So what we see over and over again is that there's a natural suppression of other substance use, even if you're targeting a single drug or single drug class. And if you think about it, with your clinical hat on, it makes sense to me that patients are well aware, very aware that if they're trying to reduce their cocaine use, if they went out drinking, their odds of slipping to using cocaine again are increased. So they just naturally suppress most drug use. The one maybe exception to that would be marijuana use, where you do see higher rates of persistence with marijuana compared to other illicit. The other big criticism, of course, is the expense. So there are a few things that we can do to help with that. One of them would be choosing price-based contingency management over the voucher. So equal effectiveness, but at a lower price point for the prizes. Another thing you can do, the top issue there, is adjusting parameters. So I talked about a little bit of these, the capping, the number of draws for the escalation, limiting the duration, frequency, and so all of those impact costs. You just have to be very, very careful that any change you're making away from an ideal protocol won't impact your patient outcomes. So, for example, you don't want it, duration is very much related to CM's efficacy. I would say 12 weeks is a standard duration of CM. Longer is better. So some clinics will do CM for 24 weeks and they get even better outcomes because you're really we're aiming for stability, right? So longer treatment is generally better. But that costs more. So most patients or most clinics will stick with 12 weeks as a standard duration, very, very reasonable. Some will want to cut it even shorter, which does cut the cost a little bit, but you don't want to drop down less than 8 weeks, I would say is the minimal. So 12 weeks ideal, no less than 8 weeks, that kind of thing. So you got to be careful when you make changes that you're not going to impact patient outcomes. Another way that clinics have found to fund CM is by monitoring increased revenue. So like I said a couple times, CM is really effective at keeping people coming into treatment, and retention is really like a bonus of abstinence-based CM protocols. So if you are getting more reimbursable dollars because of that retention, maybe some of that benefit could be set aside to fund the continuation of CM within the clinic. Other clinics have focused on donations from community agencies around, like movie tickets, gift cards, all kinds of things can be solicited as donations to fund the actual incentives themselves. A very, very great way to do it. It just takes staff time. That would be the sort of catch to that approach, but can be done. Another thing that we do regularly is buy things on sale or in bulk. So a prize might be valued at $20, but we bought it for $15, so we can save a bit of money there. Of course, in the long run, what we really need is policy change. We need, Medicare or the Department of Health and Human Services needs to get on board with allowing us to use those dollars towards CM. Right now, there's a pretty substantial barrier to that. SAMHSA has recently come on board with using incentives for patients, but they've limited it to $70, $75 per patient or $15 per gift, which is not consistent with evidence-based contingency management. That was actually particularly frustrating for me because SAMHSA had me and a few other contingency management experts come to DC and give a talk on CM, a full day experience on CM to all of their state SOAR grantees. And then at the end of the day, after we had been talking about what the efficacious ingredients of CM were, at the end of the day, they announced that they were willing to permit $75 per patient, which was just agonizing. But so we need policy change in those areas. We need insurance to reimburse contingency management and so on. There is a lot of movement at the national level in all of those areas, but we're not quite there yet. Right now, I feel like most clinics are sort of stuck with the donation, community funding, some grant sources, foundation grants and things like that in order to fund their CM. Okay, so I talked about a lot. Again, I'm open to answering questions. We talked about CM's efficacy. It works for a lot of different behaviors, abstinence, attendance, and engagement. Works with a lot of different patients, sort of almost regardless of severity, which is a good thing to know. We know that typically when rewards are implemented in the clinical settings, it does not adhere to evidence-based CM parameters. We also talked about the VA implementation and how that can provide a really solid model from which you can start if you're interested in using contingency management in your clinical practice. And we talked about a little bit of the barriers and beliefs to using CM, which fortunately many of them can be addressed with psychoeducation or things along those lines. So that is my email if you have any questions. I also put my web address, my website address. There's a lot of resources up there for if you're interested in using clinical or contingency management clinically, things like clinician manuals and whatnot. But of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.